The second concept that we need to deal with, we've looked at awareness and the awareness of yourself and the audience that you're going to be speaking to, and then the world in which that audience lives. The second concept that we're going to talk about is the C in Acts, and that's culture. Culture is a very tricky thing because culture is hard to define for any group. In fact, we could say that there's a cultural perspective or a Western culture. But what is Western culture? Generally, Western culture refers to the culture that surrounds you Europeans, and the culture, therefore, that came out of Europe and then spread through colonialization to the various colonies, whether it be America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. But even Western culture certainly is not one thing. In fact, every group within Europe would have its own particular cultural perspectives. Now, the same thing in terms of the culture of the Bible is that the culture of the Bible is even difficult to pin down because we're talking about a culture over a period of more than 1,000 years. Now, if it's 1,000 years worth of different culture, you realize that culture changes, tradition changes, customs change. But if we're going to do hermeneutics, then we need to be aware of this concept of culture. And we need to be aware of it in two ways. The first way, obviously, is we need to be aware of the biblical culture and the culture in which the Bible originated. And so in your process of exegesis, you would have done some of that process. You would have looked at some of the customs and the traditions which are within the biblical context. And so you would have understood some of them, or at least tried to interpret some of them from the original cultural perspective. But in hermeneutics, we need to think of the other culture, and that's the receiving culture, or our culture. We need to be aware of our culture, and the problem is that for most of us, we're not. We're not aware of our culture. We're not aware of our traditions. We're not really aware of our customs until we come across somebody else who's different. And it's usually in difference that we begin to acknowledge that, well, that's not how I do it. Or that's not how our family celebrates that. Or that's not how our community does the following. And that's one of the things that we need to see is that preaching, therefore, is a very cultural event. It's a very cultural action that we can do. And so, therefore, the way in which you would preach in one culture is very different to the way in which you would preach, for example, in another culture. Why? Because of those cultural differences. Now, what makes up a culture? Well, one of the basic things that makes up a culture is what we could call a worldview. Is how we see the world, how we perceive the world around us. Do we perceive the world as good? Do we perceive it as evil? Do we produce it as a spiritual thing? Or do we see it as something which is purely secular? That the world is just what it is. Do we see the world spiritually? Do we see it scientifically? Do we see the world as something which is inherently evil and bad, something that's going to come and get us? Or do we see the world as inherently good, or maybe neither? Those concepts of worldview, how we perceive the world, how we see the world, is often shown in our language. It's shown in the ways in which we can connect with language. So we can see that, for example, in the Middle East, the number or the words for desert are legion. There's lots and lots of different words for desert. Because for them, they know desert. They know the concept of desert, and so for them they can identify all the different kinds of desert. Some with water, some with trees, some without trees. Each word has got a different meaning because of the context in which they live. Also, their festivals, their feasts, their traditions, their customs will all have connections with their particular environment. What we need to see is that we are the same. Is that we also have the same traditions and customs that arise out of our togetherness as a community. And so we need to be connected to them. We need to be aware of them, aware of our traditions, aware of our customs, aware of the things that we do without thinking. And then what we have to do is, because we know what ours are, we can then adapt our worldview, or at least link the things within our worldview to the worldview of the exegesis, the worldview of the Bible. That's the most difficult thing. But you see, you can't adapt the worldview of the Bible to your world unless you've actually begun to think about your own culture. You've begun to think about how you do things, and not only how you do them, but why. You know, so often in our communities, our traditions are based in years and years and years of development, where in fact when it began, it had a reasonable explanation. But today, not so much. You can imagine that baptism, for example, is one of those. Baptism by immersion was often something practiced within the scriptures. You can see it, for example, with Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, where they stop on the side of the road and he says, well, there's enough water here, why don't I get baptized? Now, if it was just by sprinkling, then they wouldn't have needed to have enough water. They could just have a cup of water. So obviously immersion was part of the process. But immersion within the Middle East made sense. It's a hot place. Immersion in water is not going to kill you. But when, of course, the gospel moves further north into Europe, and you move into a place like Scotland, where actually to go and get baptized by immersion could actually quite literally mean your death. You can understand that a tradition can begin to develop where now you don't need to immerse in totally, but where you could just pour water or sprinkle water onto a baby or onto someone's head. You see how tradition changes by virtue of environment. But it doesn't change the whole process. It just means that we need to be aware of why we do what we do. Because when we know what we do and why we do it, we can then link it again to the things that were happening in the scriptures. Culture is very important. But as I said, culture is something that so often we take for granted. It's something that we don't really connect with. We don't even know that we are different to others until we start associating with someone who is. It's in the midst of that difference that we need to understand what we do. That we need to have a look at our cultural, traditional, custom base so that we can know our customs in order to connect them to the customs of the Bible.